I sat across from my fiancé, watching the guilt flicker across his face as he whispered the words that would change everything. They gave me a choice, he said, his voice barely audible. If I marry you, I lose everything. He didn't have to say more, didn't have to explain what his decision was. I already knew. He chose the money. But what he didn't know is that I had been keeping a secret of my own, one that would turn his world upside down. Hi, my name is Emily, and up until a few days ago, I thought I was about to marry the love of my life. My fiancé, Daniel, came from an insanely wealthy family, the kind of people whose last name carried weight in elite circles, the kind who had their names engraved on university buildings and their family portraits hanging in exclusive country clubs. Their vacations were always somewhere extravagant, their business deals made over golf games with billionaires, and their world was one I had never fully belonged to. I knew that from the moment I met them. From the way his mother's polite smile never quite reached her eyes, from the way his father barely acknowledged me at family gatherings, from the way they always made sure I understood, in 100 subtle ways, that I wasn't what they had envisioned for their son. For years, I ignored it. I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that Daniel and I were solid, that what we had was real, that love was supposed to be enough. But standing in front of him that evening, watching his hands tremble as he refused to meet my gaze, I realized how naive I had been. He exhaled deeply, like he was bracing himself for something painful, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he dropped the bomb that shattered whatever illusions I had left. His family had given him an ultimatum. If he wanted to keep his inheritance, the money, the family business, the properties, then he had to leave me. No negotiations, no compromises. It was me or the fortune, and he had to decide. The weight of his words settled between us, thick and suffocating, stretching out into a silence that neither of us seemed willing to break. I searched his face for something, regret, hesitation, even anger at the audacity of his family's demand, but all I found was guilt, raw and unmistakable, written in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table like he needed to steady himself. And in that moment I knew. He had already made his decision before he even walked into this room. He wasn't telling me so we could fight this together, wasn't telling me because he was choosing me and wanted to figure out how we would move forward. He was telling me because he had chosen them. A strange sense of calm settled over me, numbing the sharp edges of betrayal that should have torn me apart, dulling the pain of realizing that the man I had built my future around had just thrown it all away for a bank account. I should have been devastated, should have cried, should have begged him to reconsider. But instead, I felt something entirely unexpected, a slow, creeping sense of amusement. I leaned back in my chair, watching him like he was some kind of fascinating puzzle, tilting my head as the reality of the situation sank in. So, I said finally, my voice eerily steady, "That's it? You're just going to let them decide for you?" Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something that almost looked like shame. "It's not that simple, Emily," he murmured, his voice strained, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "This isn't just about money. It's about my future, my family's legacy, everything I've worked for." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "Everything you've worked for?" I repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Last time I checked, you were handed everything on a silver platter. You didn't build your future, Daniel. You were born into it." His eyes darkened, his jaw clenching as if he wanted to argue, but we both knew the truth. Without his family's fortune, he had nothing, no career, no investments, no independence. He had never needed to stand on his own because there had always been a safety net waiting to catch him, and now he was too afraid to step off the ledge without it. I waited for him to say something, anything, that would prove to me that our relationship had meant more than a bank account. I wanted him to tell me that he would fight for us, that he wouldn't let his parents dictate his life, that he loved me more than whatever trust fund was waiting for him. But he didn't. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, deep and unbridgeable, and I realized then that I was looking at a man I didn't recognize anymore. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass, my heart steady in a way that should have alarmed me. "You know," I mused, watching him carefully, "I thought this conversation would break me. I really did." I tilted my head, letting my lips curve into a smile that made his brow furrow in confusion. "But the funny thing is, Daniel, you have no idea what you're actually walking away from." His frown deepened, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. "Emily, what are you talking about?" I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make him shift in his seat. "You think you're the one making the choice here," I murmured, my eyes never leaving his. You think you're walking away from someone who needed you, who wanted a piece of your world, who couldn't stand on her own. I smiled again, slow and knowing, savoring the way his expression hardened, the way his fingers tightened into fists. But what you don't realize is that I had a choice too. And I just made mine. I stood up from the table, grabbing my purse with an ease that made his breath hitch, his confusion only growing as he watched me move. He had expected tears, had expected anger, had expected some dramatic fight for his love, but he hadn't expected this. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice sharper now, almost demanding, as if he suddenly realized that he had lost control of the conversation. I glanced at him over my shoulder, my heart beating steady, my smile never fading. "To start the life you just gave up," I said simply. And with that, I walked away, knowing that Daniel had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because what he didn't know, what his family would never have guessed, was that I had a secret of my own. A secret that would change everything. I could see the confusion in Daniel's eyes as I stood up from the table, grabbing my purse with a calmness that even surprised me, feeling the weight of the moment settle over us like a thick, suffocating fog. He had expected something entirely different, had braced himself for tears, for anger, for desperate pleading, for some dramatic outburst that would confirm his belief that I needed him more than he needed me. But I didn't give him that, didn't react the way he had assumed I would, didn't hand him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble beneath the weight of his betrayal. Instead, I simply nodded, as if I had just been told an interesting piece of gossip, something mildly amusing but ultimately irrelevant, and turned toward the door without a single glance back. "Wait," he stammered, his voice sharp with disbelief, his hand darting out to grab mine, his grip hesitant, uncertain, as if he was suddenly second-guessing everything he had just said. His fingers pressed against my skin, not with force, but with a quiet desperation, as if holding on to me for just a second longer might somehow undo the choice he had already made. "That's it? You're not even going to try to fight for us?" His words hung in the air between us, heavy with expectation, laced with the unspoken belief that I should be the one to prove something to him, that I should be the one to convince him that love was worth more than a trust fund. His words should have hurt, should have made me pause, should have made me second-guess myself the way I had done so many times before, always bending, always adjusting, always making room for the fragile ego of a man who had never been forced to fight for anything in his life. But this time they didn't. This time, there was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt, no lingering hope that he would suddenly realize what he had just thrown away. Because I wasn't the one losing something here, he was. And I had finally realized it. I met his gaze, steady and unwavering, my heart beating slow and even, my pulse refusing to race for a man who had just proven that he was willing to sell me off like a business deal that no longer benefited him. "You already made your choice, Daniel," I said, my voice light, almost conversational, as if this entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, as if his decision had left no real impact on me at all. I gently pulled my hand away, feeling the tension in his fingers, the way they resisted for half a second before falling away completely, as if he had just realized that he no longer had any right to touch me. "I just hope you don't regret it." I saw the flicker of something in his eyes then, fear, uncertainty, maybe even the first whisper of regret, but I didn't give him the chance to turn it into something meaningful, didn't give him the satisfaction of thinking he could undo this with a few carefully chosen words. Instead, I walked away, feeling nothing but relief as I stepped out into the cool night air, inhaling deeply, letting the crisp breeze wash away the last remnants of the life I had almost tied myself to forever. The weight that I hadn't even realized I had been carrying for years lifted from my shoulders, leaving nothing but clarity in its place, a sharp, undeniable certainty that I had just avoided the biggest mistake of my life. Because what Daniel didn't realize, what he had never even considered, was that I had never needed his money, his connections, or his family's approval to be successful, to be happy, to be whole. He had spent so much time assuming that I had been lucky to be with him, lucky to have access to his world, lucky to be chosen by a man whose last name carried so much influence. But the truth was, I had something far more valuable than anything he had ever offered me, something I had never told him about, something he had never even thought to ask. And soon he was going to find out exactly what he had just walked away from. The truth was, I had never been the simple, ordinary woman that Daniel's family had assumed I was, never been the desperate outsider clinging to their wealth, never been the girl who needed a rich man to survive. They saw me as someone beneath them, a woman who didn't belong in their world of private jets, weekend retreats in the Hamptons, and whispered deals made over 100-year-old bottles of wine. They had always believed I was after Daniel's money, had convinced themselves that I'd seen his last name as a golden ticket, had assumed that I was just another nobody looking for an easy life through marriage. But they had no idea who I really was, had never even bothered to ask, had never once considered the possibility that I had my own reasons for keeping certain things hidden. What Daniel and his family didn't know, what I had kept carefully buried beneath the surface for years, was that I wasn't broke, wasn't struggling, wasn't anything close to the girl they had so easily dismissed. In fact, I was far from it, had more wealth and power than they could have ever imagined, had built something entirely my own while they had been busy believing I was just another woman hoping to marry into their world. I had my own fortune, one that I had built from the ground up, one that had taken years of strategic investments, one that was growing every single day, all without a single handout, without a trust fund, without anyone's permission. I had kept it a secret, not because I was ashamed of it, not because I didn't want Daniel to know, but because I needed to be sure that he loved me for me, that he wasn't the kind of man who valued a bank account over a relationship, that he wasn't just another entitled heir who had never learned how to stand on his own. I had spent years working in silence, building my empire behind the scenes, making investments under names that no one in Daniel's family would ever recognize, setting up businesses that operated far outside their circles, ensuring that my success was mine and mine alone. And now, standing in my apartment, staring at the engagement ring that Daniel had so easily discarded in favor of his inheritance, I felt something unexpected. Laughter bubbling up inside me, so sudden and sharp that it spilled out before I could stop it. He had chosen wealth over love, had convinced himself that his fortune was the most valuable thing in the world, had walked away from me as if I had nothing to offer. But in reality, he had just thrown away something far greater than he could ever comprehend. Because while Daniel had been born into money, I had built mine, had earned every dollar, had created something untouchable by the whims of his family. And soon, he was going to find out exactly what he had lost. The first crack in Daniel's perfect little world came exactly 1 week after I walked out of his life, a moment that should have been insignificant to him, a moment he likely assumed I would spend crying over everything I had lost. But instead of wallowing in heartbreak, instead of mourning a future that had never really belonged to me in the first place, I had been preparing for something much bigger, something that neither he nor his family had ever seen coming. It started with a single news article, a headline that spread like wildfire, an announcement that sent shockwaves through the very circles that had once dismissed me as nothing more than an unworthy outsider. My name, the name they had ignored, the name they had scoffed at, was suddenly on the front page of every major business publication, tied to a deal so massive that even the wealthiest elites of Daniel's world had no choice but to pay attention. For years, I had kept my fortune quiet, had operated in the shadows, had built something powerful without ever attaching my name to it in a way that would draw unwanted attention. I had invested under business aliases, created companies that thrived without the weight of my personal life overshadowing them, let my work speak for itself rather than flaunting my success the way Daniel's family always had. But now, I was done hiding, done pretending, done playing small in a world that had never believed I had any real value. The business deal I had been working on for months, the one I had poured everything into, the one that would solidify my position among the most powerful entrepreneurs in the industry, had finally closed. A major corporation had acquired one of my startups, not for millions, but for an amount so staggering that even those who had spent their lives surrounded by generational wealth would have to take notice. It didn't take long for the news to spread, for my name to be dissected, analyzed, discussed on financial news channels, on social media, in hushed conversations between the very people who had once dismissed me. The same family that had given Daniel an ultimatum, the same people who had decided that I wasn't good enough, the same voices that had urged him to leave me behind, were now watching as my success unfolded in front of them in a way they could no longer ignore. And I knew, without a single doubt, that Daniel had seen it too, had read the headlines, had stared at the numbers, had felt the weight of his own miscalculations settle deep in his gut. He had chosen money over love, had thrown me away without hesitation, had walked away from something he had never truly understood. But now, he was realizing exactly what he had lost, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to change it. It didn't take long for Daniel to reach out, though I could tell from the way he framed his messages that he was trying to play it cool, trying to make it seem as though he wasn't completely unraveling, trying to pretend that he wasn't sitting alone somewhere, frantically piecing together just how badly he had miscalculated. His first message came 2 days after the headlines broke, a text so casual, so carefully worded, that it almost made me laugh out loud at the sheer predictability of it. "Hey, hope you're doing okay." That was it. No mention of what had happened. No reference to the fact that my name was suddenly everywhere. No acknowledgement of the fact that he had chosen his inheritance over me, only to find out that I had never needed his family's money in the first place. Just a weak, meaningless text, the kind someone sends when they're hoping to reopen a door without actually admitting they want back inside. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, didn't owe him an answer, didn't feel the slightest bit tempted to let him believe he still had any hold over me. A day later, another message arrived, this one with a link attached, a screenshot of one of the many articles that had dissected my success, my fortune, my rise in the business world. "This is insane, Emily. Why didn't you ever tell me?" His words were almost accusatory, as if I had somehow wronged him by keeping my wealth a secret, as if he was the one who deserved an explanation, as if he was entitled to answers after everything he had done. It was almost laughable, the way he framed it, the way he still couldn't quite grasp that the power dynamic between us had shifted completely, that the woman he had walked away from no longer saw him as anything more than an afterthought. Then the call came. I saw his name flash across my phone screen and let it ring twice, debating whether I even wanted to entertain whatever excuse he had spent the last 48 hours crafting. But curiosity won out, and I answered, pressing the phone to my ear, keeping my voice steady, uninterested, refusing to give him even a second of false hope. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries, making it clear that I wasn't about to waste my time pretending I had spent even a single moment pining for him. There was silence on the other end for a second, a heavy, uncertain pause, and then he sighed, the sound weighted with something that almost resembled regret. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer now, hesitant, as if he was afraid that if he pushed too hard, I'd hang up before he could say what he needed to say. I didn't know, Emily. If I had known. I cut him off before he could finish. Already knowing exactly where this conversation was headed, already recognizing the pathetic attempt to rewrite history, already bracing myself for whatever pathetic justification he was about to offer. A smirk tugged at my lips as I leaned back against my chair, my fingers tapping lightly against my desk, my voice laced with amusement as I asked the one question that would strip away whatever illusion he was still clinging to. "You would have stayed?" I said, my tone sharp but calm, refusing to let him manipulate me into giving him the reaction he wanted. "You would have fought for us if you had known about the money?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. He didn't love me. He never had. He had only ever loved the idea of winning, of holding all the power, of being the one in control. And now he had nothing. I didn't need to hear his answer, because I already knew exactly what it would have been. Already understood the kind of man Daniel truly was. Already recognized the truth he was too much of a coward to admit. If Daniel had known I was wealthy, if he had realized that I wasn't just some regular woman his family could push aside, if he had understood that I had built something even more powerful than the empire he had been born into, he never would have let me go so easily. He would have fought for me, would have convinced his parents that love was more important than money, would have made dramatic speeches about how I was worth more than any inheritance, not because he actually believed any of it, but because suddenly I wouldn't have been a financial liability. Suddenly, I would have been an asset rather than a threat to his carefully constructed world. But now, as I sat in my new office, one that overlooked the city I had built my future in, a space that belonged entirely to me, a symbol of the power I had earned on my own, I let myself enjoy the poetic justice of it all, let myself revel in the knowledge that Daniel had chosen money over love, only to end up losing both. His inheritance, the thing he had so desperately clung to, the thing he had thrown me away for without hesitation, had come with strings that were now wrapped so tightly around his life that he could barely breathe, strings that his parents were pulling harder than ever, ensuring that their investment in him didn't go to waste. He had thought he was securing his future, had believed that walking away from me meant securing his wealth, his name, his place in his family's legacy, but instead, all he had done was trade one form of control for another. I had heard through mutual friends, through the same social circles that once whispered about how I wasn't good enough for him, that Daniel had been placed in a position he despised, forced into a job he had no passion for, one that kept him under his father's thumb, one where he had no real power, no real voice, no ability to make his own choices. His freedom was gone, his options were gone, and worst of all, the life he had chosen no longer felt like his own, no longer belonged to him in any meaningful way. And the woman he had once called his fiancée, the woman his family had dismissed, the woman he had so easily walked away from? She was thriving, richer than ever, more powerful than ever, untouchable in ways he could have never imagined, and the best part of it all was knowing that he had no one to blame but himself. Daniel didn't give up easily, though, and I should have expected that, should have known that a man like him, a man who had spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted, wouldn't be able to accept the idea that he had lost, wouldn't be able to walk away from this without at least trying to reclaim some sense of control. A few weeks after his pathetic attempts at texting and calling me had gone unanswered, he found me in person, appearing at an exclusive charity gala where I was one of the key sponsors, the kind of event he had probably attended 100 times before but never once cared about until now. He must have seen the pictures online, must have realized that my success wasn't just some fleeting moment in the news cycle, must have understood that this was the only way he could get me to talk to him face to face, the only opportunity he had left to try and change the course of a decision that had already been made. As soon as I saw him walking toward me, his perfectly tailored suit still clinging to the illusion of effortless confidence, his expression carefully schooled into something between regret and charm, I knew exactly why he was there, knew exactly what he was about to say, knew exactly how this little scene was going to play out. He had likely spent hours rehearsing this, standing in front of a mirror somewhere, perfecting the tone of his voice, the angle of his apology, the way he would frame his regret in just the right way to make himself look like the victim. And for a moment, just a fleeting second, I let myself enjoy the sight of him squirming, let myself savor the knowledge that he was the one chasing now, the one who had to beg for attention, the one who had to stand there and wonder if I would even bother acknowledging his existence. "Emily," he said, his voice full of forced sincerity, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to find a shred of the woman he once knew, the woman who had loved him, the woman who had once believed he would always choose her. "You look amazing." His attempt at casual charm would have been almost impressive if it weren't so transparent, if I couldn't hear the tension in his voice, if I couldn't see the way his fingers twitched slightly at his sides, betraying the nerves he was trying so hard to hide. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable, just long enough to make him wonder if I was even going to bother responding, just long enough to make it clear that this conversation was happening on my terms, not his. I studied him for a moment, tilting my head slightly, watching the way his confident facade flickered under the weight of my indifference, watching the way he shifted uncomfortably, like he wasn't used to being the one on uneven ground. "I know," I said simply, my voice cool, detached, offering him nothing, not even the smallest bit of reassurance that this moment was going to go the way he had planned. His jaw tightened for just a second before he exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly, the confidence slipping, the real desperation peeking through the cracks. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice lower now, softer, like he was trying to make me believe this was genuine, like he wanted me to think this was some grand realization rather than a desperate attempt to fix his own regrets. "I should have chosen you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with everything he hadn't said before, everything he was only saying now that it was too late, everything he had ignored until it had finally come back to haunt him. And for the first time I saw it, the fear in his eyes, the understanding that he had lost something he could never get back. And I had never felt so completely, entirely free. I let his words hang in the air for a moment, watching as he struggled to keep up the act, as if he truly believed there was still a chance to rewrite the past, as if he thought that saying the right combination of words would somehow erase the damage he had done. His face was composed, carefully measured, but I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the barely concealed desperation, the quiet realization that this wasn't going to go the way he had imagined. He had walked into this conversation expecting a woman who still cared, a woman who would let him back in with hesitation but not refusal, a woman who would take his regret as proof that what we had was real. But what he didn't understand, what he had never been able to comprehend, was that there was no version of this story where I would ever let him back into my life. "No," I said finally, my voice unwavering, my gaze locked onto his as I watched the first hint of panic creep into his carefully composed features. "You made exactly the choice you wanted to make, and now you have to live with it. No takebacks, no do-overs, no second chances to rewrite the past into something more convenient for you." I watched as he blinked, clearly thrown off by how easily I dismissed him, by how little his presence affected me, by how completely indifferent I had become to the man who once held my heart in his hands. He had spent so long believing he was the one in control, so long believing that I would always be waiting in the background, so long believing that I would never be strong enough to walk away without looking back. But now, standing in front of him, dressed in power, surrounded by people who actually respected me, unshaken by his presence, I could see the truth dawning on him, the slow, creeping realization that he had lost something he could never get back. He inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides, his mind scrambling to find a way to turn this around, to salvage something from the wreckage of his own choices, to convince himself that this conversation wasn't slipping through his fingers like sand. But before he could say another word, before he could summon whatever excuse or apology or justification he had planned, I set my empty glass on the tray of a passing waiter, cutting him off with nothing more than a single, effortless motion. "You only regret it because you lost," I continued, my tone light, almost amused, as if I were stating something so obvious that it barely warranted discussion. "Not because you loved me. And that, Daniel, is why I will never make the same mistake you did." I saw the way my words hit him, the way his entire body tensed for just a fraction of a second, the way his jaw clenched, as if he wanted to argue, as if he wanted to convince me that I was wrong. But we both knew the truth. There was nothing left for him here. And for the first time, I could see that he finally understood it. I walked away before Daniel could say another word, before he could scramble to find another excuse, before he could attempt to twist the conversation into something that made him feel less like the failure he had become. I didn't turn back, didn't give him a second glance, didn't let him see even a shred of hesitation, because there wasn't any left to give. He had made his decision long ago, had walked away from me without regret, had believed that his wealth would be enough to keep him satisfied, but now, standing in the middle of the gala, surrounded by people who suddenly meant nothing to him, he looked lost in a way I had never seen before. He had everything his family wanted for him. The money, the carefully crafted career, the status that came with his last name, but he had nothing that actually mattered, nothing real, nothing of his own. I didn't need to see his face to know that realization was sinking in, didn't need to hear his voice to know that regret was settling deep into his bones, didn't need to stay and watch him grasp for words that would never be enough. The weight of his choices was his burden to carry now, the emptiness he felt was his consequence to live with, the life he had chosen was his to endure without the comfort of believing he had an escape. He had spent his entire life believing that money solved everything, that wealth could erase mistakes, that power could make people forgive and forget. But he was finally beginning to understand that there were some losses you could never buy your way out of, some mistakes that left permanent consequences, some choices that could never be undone. And losing me was one of them. The last I heard, Daniel was still stuck in the life he had chosen, still trapped under the weight of the decision he had made, still playing by the rules his parents had set for him, watching as the world moved on without him, as I moved on without him, as everything he had once taken for granted slipped further and further out of reach. He had lost his freedom, lost his chance at love, lost any hope of rewriting the story in a way that saved him from the outcome he had sealed for himself. And worst of all, he had lost the one thing that money could never buy, the woman who had loved him before she ever knew he had a fortune, the woman who had been willing to build a life with him, the woman who had proven that she never needed him to survive. And now, the only thing left for him was regret. As for me, I never looked back, never wasted a single moment wondering what could have been, never allowed regret to touch a life that had only gotten better since the day I walked away. I'd built an empire, piece by piece, choice by choice, refusing to let anything or anyone stand in my way, surrounding myself with people who truly cared about me, who saw me for who I was rather than what I could offer them. My life was mine and mine alone, no longer tangled in the expectations of a family that had once tried to decide my worth, no longer dependent on a man who had been too blind to see my value until it was too late. I had everything I ever wanted, not because it had been handed to me, not because I had lucked into it, but because I had earned it, because I had fought for it, because I had never needed anyone's permission to succeed. Daniel had underestimated me, just like his family had, just like so many others had, just like every person who had ever assumed that a woman's success had to be tied to a man's name. But in the end, I was the one who won, not because I had planned revenge, not because I had set out to prove something to him, but because I had always been capable of building something far greater than he could ever comprehend. He had believed that walking away from me was a sacrifice, had convinced himself that choosing his family's money was the smart decision, had assumed that I was just another woman who would fade into the background while he went on with his perfect life. But instead, he was the one left behind, watching from a distance as I thrived, realizing too late that he had never been the one in control. Because I never needed his money, never needed his name, never needed the approval of a family that had never once tried to truly know me. And I certainly never needed a man who was too weak to fight for real love, too afraid to stand on his own, too desperate to cling to a life that had already been decided for him. While he spent his days following the path his parents had carved out for him, while he lived a life that was never truly his own, I was free, I was powerful, and I was happier than I had ever been. And that was the greatest victory of all.